Hey everybody, it is Saturday, January 24th. I've been fooling around with my guitar on and off today, and in some ways I would say that it's been a little bit of an escapist thing. Like probably everybody or most people, I was going about my business this morning and learned about ICE officers in Minneapolis shooting another person, in this case a guy who was out there with his iPhone, taking video and observing what was going on, and they wrestled him to the ground, beat him up, and then shot him dead. And I've seen the videos, maybe you've seen the videos before, and I can tell you as someone who's been a lawyer since 1987, there's not even a conceivable justification for that shooting. But as I say, I've spent a lot of time, sort of my coping mechanism, I suppose I would say, is to sit around and play guitar when bad things happen and I don't really know how to process them mentally. But I've been thinking about this a lot. And when I started my most recent blog, my decision was to avoid politics, not to get into politics. But in all honesty, I don't really think this is a political thing. What I think is that we are actually facing a constitutional crisis right now in our country. I really think that's the only way to describe it. And what I mean by that is the question is really not about immigration policy or what we should do when people come into the country without proper documentation. The issue is that going back to at least the post 9/11 period, and really even before that, but especially since the post 9/11 period, the legal system, the courts in particular, have essentially placed immigration enforcement above the Constitution. They've effectively allowed the Department of Homeland Security to create this sort of rogue, militia that goes about the country and can do whatever it wants, almost with legal immunity. Now, the Department of Homeland Security exaggerates the extent to which they are actually legally immune, but the reality is that it is increasingly difficult to hold them accountable, and a lot of that stems from the fact that the courts, for almost 25 years now, have largely said that they operate outside of the constitutional order. And in the post 9/11 period, when Congress was passing the USA Patriot Act and some of these other things, a lot of lawyers, a lot of activists, the ACLU, civil liberties organizations, and so forth, were sounding the alarm that, we're giving the federal government, and in reality the state governments too, so much power that how are we ever going to rein them in if and when they start to abuse that power? Now, you could say they've always been abusing that power, and that's probably a fair argument, but they're especially abusing that power now. And this is the kind of thing that these advocates were warning about back in 2001 and 2002 and so forth. And again, even pre 9/11, but especially in the post 9/11 world, we had a lot of warnings about what happens when we have truly unchecked government power, and now we're starting to see the results of that, I think. And you could say, well, yeah, but some of the courts lately have been reining them in. There have been district court judges in the federal courts who've issued injunctions and so forth about what ICE can and can't do. And the thing is that, yeah, that's true, but there's at least a couple of problems with that. Number one, we don't know what happens to those cases when they get up on appeal. And if they eventually end up in the Supreme Court, some of us don't have a lot of faith that the Supreme Court will make the right decision. But also what often happens in courts is when the government takes an appeal, the appellate court will lift any, or rather will stay any injunction while it makes rules on the underlying case. And so that has the effect of a judge issues an injunction, but the appellate court stays enforcement of the injunction, so ICE can go about doing whatever they want to do. And of course, they don't stay in any one location forever. We learned in Chicago and Charlotte and Portland, eventually they leave and move on. And so if an injunction is stayed and then they leave the city, it effectively means the injunction never happened, right? And then again, as I said, we don't know what will happen when the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately reaches these issues. But a bigger problem than that is, what do you do? What do the courts do if ICE just says, you know what, we're not going to follow these orders? You can enjoin them. The appellate courts can uphold the injunctions. The Supreme Court can uphold the injunctions. But we're just going to do whatever we want. It's a big challenge, and a lot of people have pointed this out. It's a big challenge to figure out how to hold them accountable. How do you enforce an injunction order? A judge can say, well, ICE is in contempt, or this official with ICE is in contempt, but someone still would have to go out and arrest that person and bring them before the court in order to really hold that person accountable. And so it's like I say, I don't toss words around this lightly, but I can't figure out any other way to put it than it is a constitutional crisis. And it strikes me that the only real way you can solve this particular crisis is we got to get rid of this type of immigration enforcement. We got to start over. And again, it's not about immigration policy. I'm not going to argue with people who think that we should have stricter immigration restrictions or looser immigration restrictions. But whatever restrictions are on the books, we cannot enforce those restrictions in a way that exists, completely outside of the Constitution. And we're there, or we're at least getting to that point. And what disturbs me the most is I don't see very many politicians or even activists or journalists describing this as what it is. It's a constitutional crisis. And if we don't really deal with it as a constitutional crisis, we're certainly not going to rein this in anytime soon. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. It's probably more like 20 cents, but I would always recommend listening to The Clash when you're dealing with struggling with difficult issues, as I do. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. I think it's a constitutional crisis. I think it's about time for politicians and the general public to start treating it that way. So that's my view. Talk to you later.